Okay, so today we're going to talk about embossing. And what embossing is when you take some kind of medium, so you could use a pad, you could use a dauber, you could use a pen, right? And you make a mark on a paper that is embossing liquid. So people also use vegetable glycerin, things like that, and you can even emboss with water if you want. But what you're doing is you're making a sticky surface. So like, let's say I were to write my name, right? You're making a sticky surface. You're going to pour embossing powder over that sticky surface. You got to put it off. I like using an embossing tray. Okay. And see how there's extra pieces? If you wanted to not have those extra pieces, you can use a little puffy thing like this. Put a little powder on there, and what that does is it takes away all the static electricity. And now if we would write it, you're not going to get as much adherence or stickage to the surrounding area, right? See how that there was a whole bunch on here and there's not much on here? So once you get your embossing powder on there, then you're going to use a heat tool. Now this is, you guys could find any kind of heat tool. This is literally one I've had for probably 10 years. All it does is it makes a very hot, concentrated heat, and then this plastic thing keeps the metal part from touching anything. So we're going to melt this embossing powder. I'll show you what happens. Okay, so what we've done is we've melted that embossing powder, and now it's stuck on this paper. Now, as a mixed media artist, and those are adhered, like those will not come off. As a mixed media artist, I like the extra bits that add texture, but you may not. If you're a card maker, you may want this to be very clean and pure, in which case you would definitely want to make that more clean. You could even take a paintbrush and wipe away those little extra particles. Okay, so that is kind of how it works in a nutshell. Now, the different kinds of embossing things you can use this to write. You could use this to make marks. So say you wanted to make a series of check marks on your piece, you could do that. And what you want to do is, especially if you're using embossing powder, you don't have to hurry. Like, there's not a real quick time limit, but you do want to get the embossing powder on there. You can scrape it off. If you were to touch this, it's going to pull it off, that embossing liquid. But once it's kind of on here, you have a while before it would not adhere, right? But I tend to do it right away because you run the risk of damaging it, like I did. Okay. So that just takes a second to heat emboss. Now the reason for that is this is super fine detail. So this is very, very fine powder. And I'm going to take my embossing tray. I love this embossing tray. They cost like $7. You can use, if you don't want to buy an embossing tray, you can use a piece of typing paper, right? Just do your thing on typing paper. But so this is super fine. So these little particles in here melt very fast. Now I want to show you the difference from something that is not super fine, right? So there's different kinds of embossing powders. This is what's called a embossing enamel. And see how it's a much bigger granule, right? So if you were to look at that versus the super fine, it is a much bigger piece of material you're trying to melt. And watch how long it takes to melt this one. Okay, I have one more hint while we're doing this. If you're going to be using a super heavy granule, let's go ahead and pour our granules out on here. Get them stuck to our embossing liquid, right? If you're going to be doing this kind, you do much better to go from underneath and start to get them melted and stuck before you do it, because they will blow around. So I'm just heating the paper from underneath. See how you can see a little bit of it melting? And then once you have some of it melted, then you can come up on top and finish it up. But this is almost making, this has enough materials in it that this is actually making it puddle, right? We could see it moving around there. So the first thing to consider is, what is the density of what you want to emboss, right? So if you are doing very fine detail work, you want to use a finer embossing powder. If you're doing a big project where you want lots of cool dimension and areas, then you want to use a different one. Now, I would like to, okay, we're going to do it over here. One very cool thing about embossing powder is it actually is a little bit of a resist, right? So it's not a perfect resist, but it definitely is a resist. I'm grabbing my Distress inks here. Okay, we're going to do let's do a pink one. I got my pink brush, I got my pink thing, it makes it easy. So, you're going to get some ink on here. And you'll find that the ink does not adhere to the embossing material. So, and on the black it isn't as exciting. Let's do something. And this just has ink on it. Usually it's totally clear. Let's do, this is clear embossing powder. And this is super fine for sure. All right. We need to dump our other heavy embossing powder in here. Okay. We're going to dump our clear off. I might show you something else here too. Okay, now we emboss. Okay, and because this is effectively melted plastic, when you go over it, you'll see it acts as a resist. So that is a very cool thing to use with your embossing. I probably didn't wait for it to dry long enough, but I'm trying to keep this video short today. All right, so let's talk about now another way you can use embossing. So you can use embossing with your stamps. So say you were going to use a embossing pad. Let me dump this off. Okay. And you wanted to go in you are going to be able to use all of your stamps and then go ahead and emboss those. Okay, so that's a cool way to use embossing. And now, come to find out that it is good to have, you don't have to really worry about cleaning embossing liquid off your stamps. Okay, last thing about embossing I want to talk about is different kinds. So here, let's take this and let's do, I know I had a real stamp pad here a minute ago. All right, so now I'm going to emboss just in black, regular black ink, right? All right, so that's regular black ink. And the thing is, there are opaque, so this is opaque. You cannot see through this, so this is going to cover it. But there's also translucent, embossing powders. These are called Distress Embossing Glaze. And that means that you can see through them, okay, after you've embossed with them. And I want to show you this because it's really cool. All right. Boop, boop, boop. All right, see, we stamped the black and then we wrote my name over top of it. And you can see through the embossing material to whatever's underneath. There's also all different kinds of embossing materials. This is what's called Seth Apter Vintage Beeswax, okay? And so when you talk about embossing materials, I'm sure there's a technical term for it. To me, it feels like anything that I'm going to melt, right? So this is really, really thick. It's very thin and powdery, but when it melts, it gets very thick as a material. I have to show you this. Okay, here's a dauber. So if you want to cover kind of a big area, a dauber's a nice way to go about it because it's going to give you a nice big clean area that you can emboss on. So let's dump this out on here. Boop, boop, boop. Okay. See how that's covering kind of a big area? Okay, on this one, we're going to go from the bottom. And this is another translucent one, and now I've actually mixed, because in my tray there was black. So that's another cool thing you can do. I have some black, I have some green, I have all different colors in here that I've mixed up. And I'll show you last but not least, if you want to mix your colors, let's draw a square. You can mix embossing colors to make something really cool that isn't so plain. So see that? That's a little bit of a mix of everything. So hopefully that helps give you an idea of all the different embossing things you can do. If I was going to pick, and I have tons of embossing powders, and I have tons of different ways to emboss. So if I was to pick what you need to have some kind of embossing medium. I've tested so many of them, and the Versamark ink pad is my favorite. You need some kind of embossing powder, and if I was going to pick only one, if you said I could only have one, I would pick very fine, super fine detail embossing black powder. And then you don't have to have the little tray. I just love the little tray, and it's so inexpensive that I find that I really enjoy using it. And then last but not least, The only way you're going to emboss anything is to have a heat gun, right? Like, so you need some kind of heat gun to be able to heat up the stuff that you use. So if you're getting started and you just want to know the few things you have to have, like, you don't even need this. So you need some kind of embossing powder, some kind of embossing pad, and a heat gun. So hopefully that helps. Tara Jacobsen, Artsy Fartsy Life.